to adopt human rights protections and mechanisms. The OAU founding charter only required states to have due regard for human rights as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in their international relations and foreign policy. In 1967, we have something called the Dakar Declaration, which was a second attempt to establish human rights mechanisms. In other words, vehicles or platforms, institutions that would take what was written on paper and actually make it real and have governments work with it so that people's individual dignity was actually going to be protected. So the Dakar Declaration comes in 1967. The African jurists call on the Secretary General of the United Nations to draft a charter for the African Union, and in 1986 the charter was passed at the OAU Assembly, and it was ratified by all of the states in 1999. In 2002, the African Union, the OAU became the African Union, and the AU began its process of establishing mechanisms and platforms and processes. One of the things that did happen was that many of the countries in Africa began to set up human rights institutions, or what we call African commissions, human rights commissions. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is the regional human rights tribunal, and which has advisory and contentious jurisdiction, works on three major areas: the protection of human and people's rights, the promotion of human and people's rights, and interpreting the African Charter. Beneath the African Commission, you have a network of African national human rights institutions, which is a regional network, and it's one of the 4 regional networks that are part of the International Coordinating Committee of National Institutions set up under the United Nations. Within key states, you have national human rights commissions, such as the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, the Nigerian National Human Rights Commission, these are quasi-government bodies. They are tasked with holding their governments accountable, but they are dependent on government funding, which of course creates major challenges in terms of their independence, not to mention just them being funded adequately to do a proper job. There's also something called the Civil Society Network Against Corruption, this is a more independent association of groups and organizations. For example, it has petitioned the African Commission on Human Rights Abuses by the Nigerian military. So it is definitely a network that has taken a more aggressive stance in promoting and protecting human rights. Another major human rights commission is the one in Ethiopia, which has been trying to mitigate or trying to document the ongoing clashes in Ethiopia between the government and protesters in the Amhara and Oromo regions, and which has come under a lot of fire in terms of its inability to truly push the government for much needed reforms. And then one last example, of course, is the South African Human Rights Commission, which is guaranteed under the Constitution, and it works on equality and human rights, and has been a leading actor in promoting access to treatment for people with disabilities. It's worked on unemployment, corruption, freedom of expression, police brutality, and communal violence. Now, for many people, the real core of the human rights institutions would be the independent organizations that are not funded by the government and that constitute civil society. In South Africa, that history goes back to 1955 with the organization called the Black Sash, and it's the longest standing South African human rights organization. There was another organization called the Dalla Omar Institute for Human Rights, which helped write the new constitution, the democratic constitution for South Africa. There was the South African Human Rights Commission. I had the privilege of working with them when I was working at the American Committee on Africa and the Africa Fund. Also another organization called the Lawyers for Human Rights, and they were involved in documenting, opposing, and fighting against human rights violations linked to the apartheid system, and of course in the process became targets of the white minority government's very brutal repression. Another set of organizations emerges in Nigeria, the Civil Liberties Organization, which was founded in 1987, the Constitutional Rights Project in 1990, the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center in 2009, the Social and Economic Rights Action Center. These are all organizations that challenged various governments in Nigeria that were dictatorial, or they were literally military juntas. For example, the ones under Sani Abacha, or even the ones under General Babangida. These are organizations that challenged undue detention, arbitrary arrest. They pushed for freedom of expression and paved the way in many ways in terms of trying to use the court system to hold governments accountable and to protect human rights. Another country that had a very strong civil society institutional network was Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Human Rights Council, founded by Dr. Mesfin Woldemariam in 1991, was critical in documenting abuses by the former Derg government, and also challenging the abuses that were done in the early days of the Meles regime. And one of the other groups that was critical in terms of addressing women's rights was the Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association, which was founded in 1995 by Mahedre Paulos, that intervened on domestic issues such as inheritance, access to education, access to health, trying to defend women who were trying to respond to domestic violence, and also educating women about their rights. And sadly, all of these groups have now been very, very much gutted by the Ethiopian government's policies, because it passed sweeping legislation to shut down human rights organizations such as the Charities and Civil and Societies Act, the anti-terrorist legislation, basically really removing human rights defenders and their ability to protect Ethiopians from excesses or violations that are committed by the government. One other country which is now in the news and where civil society is also playing a major role is Kenya. The Kenyan Human Rights Commission was first founded in 1992 and registered in 1994, and has been critical, not only in challenging abuses by the Kenyatta government, but also by the previous regime and also under President Daniel Arap Moi. The International Commission of Jurists of Kenya, which was registered in 1975, the International Federation of Women Lawyers, also known as FIDA, also in 1985. And then some of the most critical ones doing basic legal advice and education work, such as Kichul Cha Sharia, which was formed in 1973, all forming critical parts of civil society that not only empower and educate people about their rights, but have also been the most vocal in questioning government policies, asking questions, and trying to hold governments accountable, which continues to be a major challenge for us. So, as I said, this is not a comprehensive list of organizations, but just some of the more, some of the better known groups. But some of the key issues that are facing the growth of human rights organizations and even the protection of human rights in the continent, I think I would list authoritarian governments. And these are the kinds of regimes that do not tolerate dissent, do not tolerate criticism. They have taken advantage of being supported by foreign governments in their wars against terrorist organizations. And so they have taken those enabling legislations or restrictions to shut down political space. They've criminalized human rights defenders. They have criminalized speech. They've shut down the internally displaced persons in Nigeria, in Cameroon, Niger, and Chad. These are now such a population, over 65 million people, that they are really pushing governments to try and do something to help them. And unfortunately, the governments are not showing the political will to sort of step up and help these people. And I think that in itself is closing the space on pushing governments to meet their international or regional obligations. And I think that's impacting the growth and the activities of human rights organizations. I think I've also already mentioned the war on terror. And that in itself is such a huge, ambitious and vaguely worded campaign that in many countries, anyone who refers to an organization can be branded a supporter. Anyone who writes on the counterterrorism efforts can be branded a supporter or a sympathizer. Anyone who questions the money or the tools or the equipment can be declared, guilty of treason. So the war on terror is distorting how governments are accountable and how they then respect human rights. The ultimate justification is if they're terrorists, then anything is justified. And that, I think, is a very, very corrosive and dangerous trend. I think that the other the other three issues I'll sort of refer to are, the economics of the continent, which continue to really be very, very alarming. There may be pockets of incredible growth and wealth that are being generated in Africa, but the large bulk of the population, which is youth, are unemployed and do not have real access to viable futures. And those kinds of economic pressures also tend to make states less tolerant to questioning their policies because they feel themselves to be under pressure. The second of the three issues I'd like to refer to is climate change, which is an economic driver that disrupts across policies, across governments, across borders, and the lack of effective planning and addressing climate change. And that leads to conflict because resources become scarce. Conflict leads to destabilization. Destabilization leads to further economic downturns. You can see that the cycle continues to weaken not only the populations, but it also creates crises for the state, and human rights are usually the first things that are sacrificed. The final of these issues is, of course, conflict. And I'm separating this out as a separate issue because it is a major crisis. It needs to be addressed. You can't have conflicts in the Central African Republic, in Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, Niger, in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Burundi, in Sudan, in South Sudan. You can see that we have an issue with how much conflict we are dealing with, and conflict in itself is extremely destructive. Livelihoods are erased and people are displaced. All of those have an impact on human rights and their development and their protections because governments justify anything in terms of winning their conflicts or ending the conflicts and don't pay attention to how they do that. I think as we have this discussion about promoting democracies or promoting the rule of law, all of these are factors that have to be taken into account. And I think I've probably almost used up all of my time, but I think that this kind of discussion needs to happen. So, thank you.
I wear two hats. But today, one will be on top of the other. One is that I am Commissioner for External Relations of one political party called FDU in Hingi, but also I am the chair of the Commission on Diplomacy of the Rwandan Opposition Political Platform. And today, that's the hat I'm wearing of the opposition political platform, which is made up of political organizations of the RNC, One National Congress, FDU Ingingi, PS Imberakuri, PDP Imanzi, and Amahoro PC. And these organizations are composed of people from different backgrounds. People who have been working with the former regimes, people who are working with RPF, which is currently in power, and have split over policy. We have people who are active in political organizations in Rwanda in 1991 when political parties were opened, but also people who have never been in any political activity. But young and old, but also men and women are in this organization. And what they share is a vision. And that vision is of a nation which is reconciled with itself, but also reconciled with neighbors. And as you'll see when it comes to specifically speak about Rwanda, is that Rwandans are across the borders, that in such a way that the Rwandan politics do affect the other countries in the region. And it's for that reason, when I speak that reconcile with itself and the neighbors, it's important that to be reconciled to our neighbors. And we think that democracy is a good tool. However imperfect it is the best tool to manage the naturally divergent and the competing society demands, as well as political competition. I also think that democracy is good for development because it helps to unlock the energies and talents of everybody, but also it allows free flow of information that allows innovation. So indirectly, it also affects the economic development of a country. We're given with human rights, which underlie democracy and rule of law, we have peace, which again is important for economic development. And once you have peace and economic development, then indirectly, you tackle the issue of refugee crisis. And when we speak of human rights, political competition, the history has showed us that the people will fight at any cost for their freedom. My brother talked about the fight for independence, when fighting for independence. People fought for independence. When you take Europe, which is actually, we say, the mother of democracy, there has always been people fighting for their rights, being executed, arrested, and until they got their freedom. If you look at the Europe 1940s, the evolutions which took place there, there were people who are fighting for their rights for political participation. And one thing we have seen even in the case of Europe, where there has been resistance, there was a violent change. You look at the question of, you see at France in these times, there was resistance from aristocracy, violence. As opposed to the British, the English, where they are constantly having reforms whenever there was a pressure. And they used to call it, you give in order to preserve. So they avoided violent revolutions by giving in at every pressure. And therefore, as we think in the political organizations that we cannot stop the cycle of violence through democratization, respect of human rights, and the rule of law. Because we believe the cycle of violence in Rwanda is not due to the assumed or self-declared discourse that there are congenital hatreds between Hutu and Tutsi. We think rather it's because of political and social exclusions which were exploited by political elites to galvanize or get support from people from their own groups. And all the time, when there was resistance, there was revolutions. In 1959, 1973, they wanted the coup, and 1990, when you have the question of refugees. And therefore, democracy, human rights, not for its own sake, because it is good, but also it is because we think it is a tool to have peace and development for Rwandans and for the region. I'll not probably speak of the whole of Africa. My brother has covered very well the issue of human rights in Africa. But I think it would be too bit generic. And I thought if I took the two examples of Rwanda and Kenya, give a more specific glimpse of what actually the importance of democracy and in terms of avoiding violence. And I took the two countries. Why? Because if you take Rwanda, I wanted to present the Great Lakes region of Africa, and Kenya to represent the East African community. And if you look to the African continent, you look at the Great Lakes region and East African community, actually it's the belt which comes from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. And that part of Africa, if I can quote the Albright, the former Secretary of State, who said of Great Lakes, she was talking to the OAU Summit 1997, was saying, Africa matters. And right now, no place matters more in Africa than the Great Lakes region. He said, the region's natural resources and the human resources, as well as the strategic location, make it a catalyst or a stumbling block for African development and African unity. And one day Mobutu also said of it, he said, Africa is like a pistol, and the trigger is in Zaire. It was called Zaire. If you look at the map of Africa and look at Matadi, it looks like actually a trigger. So what happens in Africa, in the Great Lakes region, affects Africa. And indeed, during the war, following the invasion of Rwanda, invading the Congo, who had almost 90 countries involved, it was called the First African World War. So this region, I took this region as important because of that reason. And Rwanda, of course, because Rwanda has become the epicenter of destabilization in that part of Africa. And there's no other country in Africa, region in Africa, which has lost more than 6 million, with the biggest human catastrophe since the Second World War. So destabilizing that part is important, and we feel as a political organization, political platform, that stabilizing this part of Africa, so central to Africa, then you can't have peace in Africa. And Kenya, the East African community, Kenya is an important player in East Africa because of its geography, its location, and its economy. So also the stability of Kenya is very important for East Africa. And put together, this is so important for us. And that's why I should focus on democracy in this part of Africa. And to show how our organization is so important, keen on democracy. And when I speak of Rwanda and probably Kenya, it's not because I'm in the opposition, but I think these are the facts that are so important to take care of for anyone, even if it was not me talking about this. And I have had a problem sometime when I meet somebody. I say, where do you come from? I say, from Rwanda. He said, are you a Hutu or a Tutsi? I tell him, I said, why do you ask me first? Let me talk to you, and after I have talked to you, you ask me. Because if I say I'm a Hutu, you put me in a box. If I'm a Tutsi, you put me in another box. So the discussion will start by putting me in a certain place. So in this case, also when I speak of Rwanda, it's not necessarily because I'm in the opposition. And I feel if the Rwanda government would do the right things and make me irrelevant or the position irrelevant, I'll be happier. But we are forced to take the position because we love that country, because we love Africa and people with that region. So that's why I've taken these two countries, and in my country in particular, not because of any hatred, and because that we need the peace in that part of Africa, we need the peace for Rwandans. And when speaking of democracy, probably to be on the same wavelength, have a common ground, when you speak of this democracy, what are you actually talking about? So I thought it was important that actually we go a little bit again into this thing together. What does it entail? What does democracy entail actually? And we feel that actually, first thing is the sovereignty of the people. That actually the power rests in the people. And the meaning that actually that the people have the right to be consulted on issues that matter to them. You have got children, we say at a certain age, even our kids, we have to take a decision about them, we have to ask them what they think about it. So the people is again much more important that have to be asked. And how do they exercise this authority? As you know, it is through elections. Elections for why? Because one, they have to be asked. And secondly, it is because they need the best. There must be competition. Because at the end of the day, we people who want power. Unless you create mechanisms, then you have trouble. But secondly, it's able to get the best policies and the best people in that position. But this means allowing people to stand for elections. And when you come to Rwanda, you will see again, is everybody allowed to compete for these positions? And the second, this competition, I see one thing very clear. It is not who say that democracy is too complex for the Africans. And this is a luxury which must be enjoyed by other people except Africans. But what is complicated about it except they want to take part in decisions that concern them? The second element is the Constitution, the rule of law. The rule of law there has to be a limit to the people who govern them. They can't just anything that they want if it is that they have the power. And the third, I think, which is important, the freedom of expression. Again, when we compare Kenya and Rwanda, we see how far have we moved in that field. But also the third, which is very important, is a free press. Which actually, in the case of Rwanda, we see again when it comes to comparisons, how does it compare with Kenya? But also the other part is separation of powers. Because under normal circumstances, these independent judiciary, independent parliaments, all of these and the civil society, they help to manage or to open a space for debate on issues. And when it's not there, then again you have this problem. So it creates a normal, free, and a peaceful way of getting with the views without getting into fighting. So we feel that's important. But security, and again, the separation of the security services from the government. And then you come to Kenya, we see again the difference who is in charge in Rwanda in terms of the security forces and Kenya, and the state of human rights. I think it was so eloquent about human rights, importance of human rights, that actually I would dilute his point he made about human rights if I thought to talk about it again. So we think that these are not, we can't believe that the things are so complex for Africa, and that's what the dictators say, and with their sponsors in Europe and other places, that this is too complex for poor Africans. And therefore, they need what they call benevolent dictators, despots, to keep their brutal minds in check, unless they can erupt any time and cause chaos. So that's why they want strong men. And unfortunately, this culture is being supported by dictators. So it's like a fascism, that actually we have the answer. And we will see again in the case of Rwanda how this is going to prevail. So now, probably having said that, probably let's look at now the comparison. How does it compare if you take the countries? Let's go to the issue of, for instance, the issue of the Constitution or the separation of powers. When it comes to the sovereignty and elections, as you know, for the case of Rwanda, we said one thing is that there must be people are free to compete for elections. But the case in Kenya, although there isn't fighting, but at least we know that there have been troubles after the war, there are elections, they are fighting between the tribes, but at the end of the day, people can compete freely for elections. The case of Rwanda, the most prominent, the most recent, you have seen the case of Diane Wigara Shima, because she tried to stand. The Electoral Commission, which used to be independent, decided that she should not stand. Before in 2010, you had the government the same. So it's the government which decide whom do I accept to stand for elections. So the first criteria of democracy is gone. It is not perfect in Kenya, but at least there's a process. So when you come to separation of powers, of course, you have seen that for the first time, even not only in Africa, in other places, what the Supreme Court can decide to annul elections won by the incumbent. You can annul the one which is the opposition, but annulling the election by an incumbent is unheard of. And the judge is still there, he's not in prison without being killed. This is a very complete discrepancy, difference between the two. But also, when you come to parliament, the parliament, I remember there was people in the parliament can speak their mind. When you get the case of Rwanda, I remember the case of Human Rights Watch. The parliament was one who said, chase them away. When the EU passed a resolution about human rights in Rwanda, the Rwandan parliament and the Senate, they passed a motion to ask the parliament, EU parliament, to change their position. Because for them, they think parliament is the same as the executive. Again, another show that actually there is no separation of powers in Rwanda. And we have a case where we had one Supreme Judge, court with Supreme Court, a Khan was killed and he disappeared. Nothing happened. So on that score of separation of powers, the powers are in the state. There's one person, the president. And the president recently, the case of Diane, he was in the parliament, he said, you know, when he was trying the ceremony for the new cabinet, he said, you must arrest everybody who has cheated government, tax evasion, even those who try to stand for presidency. And the following day, they came down on Diane. And along the way, the case was dropped of tax evasion, it became something else. signatures of people who died. Imagine to get a signature of someone who has died. What a miracle. It's a miracle. That to get a signature of someone who has died, signing for you. Again, we can see the separation of powers is not there. And when you come to security forces in Kenya, remember 1982, when there was attempted coup, it was actually foiled because there's separation of powers between army and the state. But Rwanda has been called now an army with a state, rather than a state with an army. And an army with a state, rather than a state with an army. So everything is decided by the army. Once the army has decided, everybody follows. So again, the security forces are really in power. Respect for human rights again in Rwanda, that one exactly we don't have to say there is enough documentation by Human Rights International, by Human Rights Watch. So probably that has covered so well. I probably it is not any. I would do any harm. I would do harm if I try to dilute what he eloquently said. Of course, there's peaceful competition for and the transfer of power. This has been the issue of Rwanda for all the time. 1959 violent, 1973 violent change, 1994 violent change, and unfortunately, when you look at the future prospect of Rwanda, it leads towards that. And actually, I would quote somebody, and another person who was talking about Rwanda, the future of Rwanda, was saying, I quote, he says, envisioning a radiant Rwanda is only possible if one wears the blinders that the government so confidently wears. He said, underneath the splendid success are disturbing realities that are systematically contained. So you will hear of the stability of Rwanda, but the stability is only because of depression. Women in parliament is 4%. That's the blinder. What has those women changed in terms of policy towards women? We speak about economic development miracle. Whom does this economic miracle serve? They say now the economic disparity has doubled since 1994. And therefore, again, the issue of horizontal inequalities, because of the system in place, these riches disparities are a pattern along ethnic lines. And all research shows that when you have such disparities, then you are likely to have a problem. Actually, there is a study which was done by the USLA showing actually that Rwanda is one of the most exploited countries in the world after Syria, Eritrea, and Sudan. And actually is one of the countries which are at risk of civil war, Rwanda. So when you speak of the economic miracles, actually what is happening now is more toward something disturbing than anything else. Women in parliament, stability, national reconciliation. Again, they say a healed nation. Unfortunately, this is a blinder because there cannot be reconciliation without justice. And you know that after this lady, the president of FDU, Ngabire Umuhoza, why she was put in jail, one of the things God said, we cannot have genuine reconciliation unless there is justice. And justice is not, when you call for justice, it's not equating genocide and other crimes. We're not saying that a crime must be punished irrespective of committed the crime. And therefore, each one has committed a crime, you have to be responsible for it. And unless you do that, you are building again a volcano for a future problem. So the Rwandan problem is not in any way or form reconciled the nation. And we are heading probably, I'm not a prophet of doom, and I don't want to be accused of planning any new genocide. But the fact of the matter is, the indicator, the red lights, that actually continues in this manner, we are heading for another trouble. And again, when you look at the politicians with Dayan and Gabile, who are saying, unless we address these issues, then we are in serious trouble. And I tell you one thing, do you know, there were the ladies, the 7 ladies, old ladies, they were a religious sect. They were taking a letter to the president to say, they were saying that unless the president changes the course, then the country is going to be more blood than before. They were arrested for insurrection, for they were inciting people against the government, because they were saying, what you are doing, you are just throwing them into trouble. And so what can we ask? So for Kenya, definitely the politics are not doing well. There are troubles, but at least there is a glimmer of hope that each time there has been a pushing, has been a compromise. In 1990, there was political parties were about 1982, but under the pressure they were open in 1992. And there was trouble, but after that, it continued. 2002, again, there was a more accepted to leave power, 2002, to Kibaki. That was a change. 2007, there were troubles again, but there was a new constitution trying to look at what are the loopholes. Even this time round, after the first run, the electoral commission tried to look all the loopholes. They didn't perhaps close all of them, but at least that this willingness to change slowly. And as I say about Europe, you're giving order to preserve. There is a kind of a tendency, there's a kind of hope that despite the problems, there is a willingness to change and move for another place. Whereas for Rwanda, unfortunately, there is more closing down. Even after getting 99%, is not enough. Because the system is nervous. Anything that comes up, you're going to think we are in trouble. And as Adriano was saying, how do you, after getting 99%, fear a 35-year-old girl who has not been in politics if you are so confident that actually you are very so popular? So what it translates is that actually we are likely to have more and more depression, and of course the Brimama resistance. But what gives me hope, these young people like Diane, like these boys and the girls in our party, FDU in Nyingi, 8 of them are in prison, also for they are accused of forming an armed group or of insurrection. When I see these young people, not they all like me, accepting to stand for this, their rights, and the political participation, it gives me hope. And what we do as the P5, what I was saying, the position is, how do you preempt? How do you preempt to ensure that what happened in Rwanda does not happen again? And of course, we ask you, everyone, how can you help us? How do you help us to ensure that we preempt, that we never again doesn't become again? Not through the false acceptance or the false knowledge, the false belief that by oppression, by depression, that will stop it. The more depressed, the more violent it will be. It's not only in Rwanda, but it has been happening in the place in Europe. Or probably, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Activities, I want to just briefly tell you some stories about some of our survivors. And the names I'm using, we only use their names when they've given us permission to use their names. Sometimes we use pseudonyms. These are people's real names. So one of our survivors is Fakade, and he's from Ethiopia. He contracted polio when he was very, very young, and he started working as an accountant for Ethiopian Airlines. There was a tremendous amount of discrimination against him because of his disability, but he still succeeded in getting a very good job there, and he became a leader of the Union of Ethiopian Workers. At some point, the ruling party, which is the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, which I'll just refer to as the ruling party, they decided to fire many of the employees in his union and replace them with people from the ruling party. So as a union leader, he objected. You know, why are they just getting thrown out and losing their jobs just for the ruling party to cement its control in the country? So he started speaking out, and they started beating him, and then they forced him in his job to remove all his clothes and tried to push him out into the corridor so he would have to walk naked in front of all his co-workers. When he refused to do that, they kept beating him again and again, and finally they made him walk out naked into the corridor in front of all of his employees. We call this psychological torture. So those of us who study torture, there's physical torture where everyone is familiar with that, with wounds on your body and so forth, and this is a very good example of what we call psychological torture, this type of humiliation. So then he eventually left Ethiopia, and he's with us now. Another survivor, his name is Guya, and Guya is one of the bravest survivors we have. He actually testified in front of the House of Representatives, the Subcommittee on Africa, about what happened to him. And he also was contracted polio, and he's in a wheelchair. And what happened to him is he was the head of an organization of disabled people in Ethiopia. There's a special organization for blind, another one for deaf, and these are for disabled people in wheelchairs. And he was the head of the organization. He was not a political person. He just was someone who was militant. What was he militant about? He was militant about disabled people getting access to the university. There was his militancy. And so the government tried to force him to join the ruling party. He refused. He was arrested many times. And one time he was put in a truck, taken out to a forest, and thrown into the forest with his wheelchair. This is all part of his testimony, which is on a PDF file online. He said, well, they thought I was going to get eaten by the hyenas. So I always make a joke, and I said, luckily he smokes. The smoking isn't good, right? But because he smokes, he was able to make a little fire, and the fire saved his life. Because he made a little fire, sitting down, he can't move around, he found some sticks, and local people found him and rescued him. And then later on, now he's in the United States. He already has asylum, so he's safe. And I'll tell you one more story about a survivor named Demso, and he's a marathon runner. He's won over 30 medals, and he also was in a news conference on Capitol Hill, and he makes his living by running. He was training to qualify for the Olympics in 2015 when he decided to participate in a peaceful demonstration of the Oromos. The Oromos are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, which have traditionally been marginalized and discriminated against, although of course everyone now, unless you're a government supporter, is suffering in Ethiopia, not only the Oromos, but they were traditionally marginalized. And all he did was participate in a demonstration, so he was arrested and tortured on his feet. And when he was tortured on his feet, the torturer said, we're doing this so you can never run again. That's why we're doing this to you. So now he's in the United States. He can walk. He is hoping that he's going to get asylum and eventually get some surgery, and we hope he will be able to run again. So we've also had women. It's very frequently about 30% of our survivors are women, and many of them have been raped. Rape is a form of torture. And I'll just tell one story of one woman who was raped and she was not even a political activist. Her father was the activist, and she was tortured and raped. In prison, she was impregnated by the torturer. And eventually she came to the United States, she got asylum and so forth. And one of our women also spoke openly about what happened to her. It's very, very difficult, of course, for women to do that, but I always bring it up because this is done systematically to women all over the world when they're tortured, and women in conflict, and so that's why I make a point to always bring it up. Okay, so our organization I want to focus now on the advocacy part of what we do, which is my job. We focus on Ethiopia a little bit more because over 70% of our survivors are from Ethiopia, simply because there's a lot of Ethiopians that settle in the Washington, D.C. area. So for those of you who don't know this area, we talk about Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Northern Virginia. It's kind of one area, and there's just many, many Ethiopians that live here. So, of course, many of the survivors of torture will come to Washington and come to our organization. But we also have the second largest groups are survivors from Eritrea and Cameroon. We also have LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender survivors. We have a few people from Bangladesh, Baluchistan, Pakistan, which is a region of Pakistan, and I'd say 98% of the survivors are from Africa, and only 2% from non-African countries. And that's just because we're in the Washington area. You know, if you went to other parts of the country, you would get maybe some Syrian survivors, Iraqi survivors, Chinese. So I'm not trying to say that that's who all the survivors are in the United States, but that's who we see in the Washington, D.C. area. So one of the reasons I'm going to focus in Ethiopia, I mentioned, is because we have so many survivors. They are professionals, speak English very well, which helps if you want them to talk on Capitol Hill, and very, very motivated to continue the struggle for human rights wherever they are. The other reason we are going to be focused on Ethiopia and human rights abuses in Ethiopia is we were fortunate to have a champion of human rights. He's a Republican congressman named Chris Smith from New Jersey. He does not have a lot of Ethiopian constituents. He just really cares about human rights in Africa and all over the world. And there's a congresswoman named Karen Bass, who's from California, who's a Democrat, who's been our strong ally, and another Republican named Mike Kaufman from Colorado. We have not worked with him, but there are Oromos and other Ethiopians who've developed a close relationship with him. And this is not from our organization, but one of our partners. And why I'm going to bring this up is this is because Ethiopian Americans decided to work very closely with the congressman, and he has become their supporter. And this shows that the African diaspora can have a real influence if they work in an organized way with people in Congress. And that was a huge success for them. Also, we developed a relationship with Senator Ben Cardin, who's from Maryland, and Marco Rubio, who is also a champion for human rights, former presidential candidate for the Republican Party, Republican from Florida. So, because of a lot of our efforts, what happened is we were able to work with other organizations, and that is one of our big successes. TASS is a very small organization. We only work with 300 survivors a year, but we have great partners from Amnesty International, and I'm not saying this because ADOTE is here. If he wasn't here, I'd say the same thing. Amnesty, specifically ADOTE, has been one of our great partners working on this issue about Ethiopia. We also work very closely with the Oromo Advocacy Alliance, representing Oromo Americans, the Amhara Association of America, and also with Human Rights Watch and Freedom House. So for anybody who knows anything about Ethiopia, Oromos and Amhara and often are arguing with each other, in conflict with each other, but those two organizations, the Amhara Association of America and the Oromo Advocacy Alliance, work together with each other and with us. So all of us have become friends, we text each other, we have good personal relationships, and I just mentioned to ADOTE before we came in here, is we all care more about the people we're working with than our own little, how little people who are supposed to be allies get too obsessed with their own egos. We live here in Washington, D.C., so people know about egos here in Washington. But all of us that are part of this group really care about the issues. And this alliance that we have, for example, the Oromo Advocacy Alliance, they drew up a petition that they brought to Senator Ben Cardin, and that was one of the reasons Ben Cardin became involved in this. A lot of the people from the Amhara Association, they live in what we call red states, dominated by Republicans. They were able to bring a lot of Republicans onto this struggle. So, as a result of all this work, we ended up with two different resolutions in Congress. One is called House Resolution 128, the other is called Senate Resolution 168, and these are resolutions. What's our great victory is that both of these resolutions were passed by the Foreign Affairs Committees in Congress. So that means that House Resolution 128 was passed unanimously by what's called the House Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives, and the Senate Resolution 168 was passed unanimously by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And all of these things would not have happened if we did not have this coalition that we're working together, and also the power of our survivors. So now I'll talk a little bit about our survivors, what we did. So part of our role is to organize visits in Congress, and we have now on House Resolution 128, we have 71 co-sponsors, which is a lot of people for a human rights resolution in Congress. 71 members of Congress, and it's truly bipartisan. And for anyone who's following what's happening in Washington, D.C. and the United States is polarized, more divisions than I've ever seen before in my lifetime. But we still got bipartisan support for these resolutions, and the leader on the House side was a Republican. So this is like a big deal. So what we do, what my job is, I organize these meetings in Congress for our survivors. We'll go in with a group of about 5 people. Sometimes we have people from the other organizations that join us, and we train them to tell their stories to congressional staff. So they are able to go in and tell their story in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, what happened to them, just like the stories I just told you about those 3 survivors, in about 10-15 minutes, and then we ask the member of Congress to sponsor this resolution. House Resolution 128 in the House, Senate Resolution 168, and we're proud to say that almost a third of the 71 co-sponsors have been because of the meetings with our survivors. And what's great is that this is very bipartisan. The congressional staff in Republican and Democratic offices, everyone is extremely, extremely respectful to our survivors. How can you not be when you hear these kinds of stories? Plus, we don't argue with members or their staff. We're just explaining what the stories are. We talk about our organization and our opposition to torture throughout the world. We focus, as I said, especially on Africa, because that's where our survivors come from. And we're a survivor-led advocacy program, so I determine what I'm going to put on the agenda by listening to them. And when I talk about, for example, that women were raped, I have to get permission from them. If they don't want me to say it, I won't say it. And they help direct me in the direction that we want our advocacy to go in, so they feel like leaders also. And it's the best part of my job is when as a result of one of the meetings we have, a member of Congress will co-sponsor this resolution. I send them an email and I say, guess what? You met with Congresswoman Bass's office or whoever, and because of you and your meeting, this member of Congress is now sponsoring this resolution condemning human rights abuses in Ethiopia. And that makes them feel great. Let me tell you just a little bit about what this resolution is. So these resolutions condemn human rights abuses in Ethiopia. Ethiopia, since 1991, has been ruled by one party. We call it the ruling party, and it's I guess you could call it a soft dictatorship, I don't know, a medium dictatorship. I'm not sure what kind of word, harsh dictatorship you would use, but the resolution condemns the Ethiopian government for excessive use of force, otherwise known as killing people who participate in a peaceful demonstration. It's called excessive use of force. And also, it calls for releasing journalists and human rights defenders and average people who have just been arrested because they participated in a peaceful demonstration or just criticized the government or refused to join the ruling party. So one of the people I mentioned, Guya, who is a disabled man, he was not an activist. He was an activist for disabled people. He was the very first Ethiopian in this country, disabled Ethiopian, to go to Addis Ababa University. But he was tortured because he would not join and promote the ruling party. So, we also visit a lot of students and talk to students in the United States, religious congregations, and we say that was like to keep your job advocating for disabled people, not only would you have to join the Democratic or Republican Party, you would have to go out and speak in support of them and recruit other people to join a party that you don't support. And the students kind of look at us like it's such a strange thing. They don't even understand how somebody could be forced to do that. But I always bring that up because we have a lot of the survivors who just refuse to join the ruling party. This resolution is also talking about applying something called the Magnitsky, Global Magnitsky Act, and that's named after a Russian dissident named Sergei Magnitsky, who was killed in Russia. But what the resolution does, it talks about sanctions against individual people in Ethiopia who are held responsible, accountable, to hold them accountable for these excessive human rights abuses. So that's kind of what's happened with the resolution so far. Now, we have a big challenge before us. The big challenge is that Ethiopia is also a counterterrorism ally with the United States in East Africa. So it works with the United States to counter al-Shabaab in Somalia, and it also participates in peacekeeping forces in Africa. So it's seen as an ally of the U.S. in this war. And the United States gives over $500 or $600 million a year in aid to Ethiopia. So it gets a lot of money, and it's a reliable counterterrorism partner. So what's happening now is Ethiopia, the government, is not happy with these resolutions, obviously. And so we found a speech by this congressman from Colorado where he said that the Ethiopian government, and this is public, he made this public, threatened that it will stop cooperating with the United States in counterterrorism if the House of Representatives votes on one of these resolutions. And so right now, the resolution is not being voted on in the full House. I know for those of us who don't live in the Foreign Affairs Committee in each body of Congress, we're talking now about a resolution in the full House of Representatives for the 435 people there, or whoever happens to show up that day. So the Ethiopian government says, we will stop cooperating with you in counterterrorism if you vote on this resolution. So some of our partners, like Amnesty International and Freedom House and Human Rights Watch, we're all working to try to change that. But again, I'm going back to the partnership of all our organizations. One of our partners found out about the speech made in Colorado. It wasn't TASS, it wasn't us. So our challenge now is we are part of a movement, and I tell our survivors we're part of a movement to support human rights in Ethiopia and in all of Africa, and again, all of the world, but the focus on Africa because that's where our survivors are from. And we've already had a huge victory, and we will continue to work for to end human rights abuses, and we will not give up. If people don't vote on this resolution, that doesn't mean we're going to give up. We already had huge victories, and what we hope is that other people in the African diaspora can learn from some of our victories about how you can meet. If you go in, you meet with congressional staff, you make phone calls, it really works. People maybe don't know how hard that is to believe, but even if you make a phone call, a member of Congress is not going to write down everything you said, but somebody will make a little mark. Oh, somebody called today to support health care. Somebody called today to put more restrictions on availability of guns. People pay attention to constituents and other people who call Congress, and I hope that our victories so far, and hopefully our future victories, will be a good example to others in the African diaspora who want to support human rights and end to torture in the United and all over the world. So.
Thank you. 20 degrees. And I was coming from Kenya when the temperature was above 90 degrees. It was a challenge. I did not know what to do and how to actually overcome the situation in which my brother and I found ourselves in. We did not stay in Suffolk for long due to the fact that the weather was not so good. The language was also a challenge Neither one of us spoke English, and we did not know how to navigate the system in that particular country, state. Then we had to figure out how can we get out of there and where could we go. Luckily enough, we found our ways to Nashville, Tennessee, a place I call home, and still believing it's as a home. Came to Nashville within that spring period. For those who know Nashville we had, and Nashville we have now are two different Nashville. It has changed, but still there are things that I will never forget about Nashville. I remember a time when I had to work 2 jobs, and also at one point I had to cross from a distance to a distance to get into where I work. And at some occasions, I would not find a way to get to my home where I used to live. I have to walk, which used to take me many, many hours, 2 to 3 hours to get into my home place. It was also difficult in Nashville to learn English, especially for someone who was no longer a child, but had grown a little bit older for this system to be not allowed to attend classes, but also young enough to start from A, B, C, D. It was a huge challenge. And when I talk about my book, My New American Dream, I had talked a lot about why and what it takes for someone like me and the rest who have come to this country and have figured out how they can actually rebuild themselves in their life so that they can be different and they can also make themselves and their communities different. I remember attending a class with people who drop out from high school, never had the foundations of any of basics training. But I was sat together with people who would drop out from high school. I was given a big book to read. I can't read a single of it. I did not know what to do and where to begin. But it turned out that friends who was in the class were able to talk to me in a very uneasy communication language, using all this sample for us to be able to communicate with an instructor, of whom I got an assistant from. The instructor were able to tell me what to do for me to make a change for what I was doing to get a learning. I'm saying this to say that it was not easy for someone who had not had a foundation back home. And why did I not get the kind of chance some children should have got? This is the reason why I think this occasion could have been a great dialogue for us to talk about what can we do here to solve and to also impact the challenge our people are having back home. Children who did not get an opportunity like I did, that still cannot read or write. Women, in a bigger number, are in disadvantage in Africa. Girls cannot support their moms because they are even prevented, not only a basic of knowledge, but also even the basic thing in life. Our system is not allowing us to challenge ourselves to think critically and to a way that we can actually make a difference in life. I had a PowerPoint that I was supposed to share to give you more detail of exactly why I think our work here in the West could also have a significance to what we can actually do back home. In talking to many of the academia, I find out that a lot of educated Africans have closed their eyes from their back home contributions. Many of whom are already blacklisted and are told not to go back, including myself, to their own countries because they talk critically of their countries. because the people who are ruling us do not want us to say anything bad about them and their rule. But that doesn't really mean we can have to stop. It doesn't really mean we cannot stand tall. It doesn't really mean we have to stop advocating. And it doesn't really mean we have to stop thinking for ways to better the community that need our contribution. I think there are a lot we can do here. And when we talk of African democratic system, we also have to talk about what do we do, what do we know, and what have we learned while we are here. So those are some of the things that I had in my presentation. The location has not yet changed. I would be happy to share them here with you. But because of that, two things that I wanted to leave you with is this. In any changing system, people have to figure out what they can really do to make an impact into that change. I think Africans need to rethink of ways they can actually do things. Because I would not see any reason that we cannot really be the better nation, the better country, and the better people when we all have everything that it takes for anyone to build anything he or she wanted to build. What don't we have in Africa? We have the resources enough to build anything. We have both human and other materials. I think the lucky part, what we are lacking is unity and understanding of our vision. Some of the leaders who have come before us, some tried, such as Nelson Mandela of South Africa. Maybe some few that I could mention some of them, but chose not to. They might have a mission and a vision of what they want for Africa. But what is the African of this generation? Number of academics, civic societies, and scholars who are here were supposed to do a lot for themselves, are not figured out how they can actually work together. Why could a meeting like this not be attended by a number of Africans who have time today? Why could we not think of a way we can all work together to impact the political and social challenges that are facing our community? Why could the unity be not the priority one? But if we are not doing this that are for us, who's going to do them for us? So what I have actually talked about it in my New American book is this. I think the world has changed. But I think unless all of us take into ourselves that we have to contribute to this change, the change will actually get us while we're behind to the change. And that will not be good news. I think it will be when we all understood that those who are not working for change, the change will work for them in a bad way. But in order for us to overcome and to work into the solution of that change, we all have to prioritize the thing that can actually move us forward. And one of the things that I think will move us forward to make a difference in this country is for us to work together. It's for us to identify what are the priorities that we have. If the US government can go and meet with leaders, some of the dictators back home, and try to invest in some of those countries, and we, the people who are here, who also are a part of this country, and also part of the back home country, who are not involved into those kind of dialogue, I think there's something that is missing. And the situation will continue like this in that cycle without any way out. That will not be good. And the reason we should not be informed is because we might not be informed because we're not organized. If we are organized, we're working in one voice, we can actually tell people what to do for us. And instead of them doing it for us, we should do it for ourselves. and for others to actually come and join us. This is what I believe. I believe the dream we have in this country is not about that whole dream of buying a home, buying a car, and getting education and better job. That's not, I think, what is supposed to be a dream for us. I think the dream we need in this country is after our eyes are open, after we've seen the needs and it could be done by us, we work for those needs. We work for those needs. We work for people who are suffering. Africa should not be considered the way it is, if we have the capacity, as I think we do. But we cannot serve the mother African if we're not serving our African here. We're not doing anything for ourselves. If we're not coming to solve our problem, we're not working together, then it would be difficult for us to overcome the challenge that is facing us. With that, I will be giving chance to my other friend.
Africa for about, how many years? Altogether 18 years. I'm a teacher by profession, a missionary, and a human rights activist. But this activist has urged me to find out about the people where we were serving. So my presentation today is meant to be under the heading Meetings with People from Gone By Times about regional cultural history in East Africa. A couple of years ago, I'm from Sweden, so I refer to Swedish television. Swedish television ran an episode of the BBC documentary about the unknown kingdoms of Africa, dealing with Buganda and Bunyoro in Uganda. There is a third old kingdom in East Africa, which was at least as important in the past, namely Karagwe. It is situated in the far northeastern corner of present Tanzania. For a period of altogether 7 years in the 1970s, I had the privilege to get closely acquainted with Karagwe, its land and people. During the first 5 years, we lived in a surrounding where there were still people who had never seen a European. Now I hope I will be able to communicate a narrative that can serve as a message, creating a meeting place where people from gone by times are given space to express themselves on their own terms. Most of my informants have passed on to join their elders. It is said that when an old man or woman dies in Africa, it is as if a library is burnt down. But I was given the rare opportunity to document some eyewitness accounts from the past. Those accounts still live on and have helped me to try to understand glimpses of cultural historical developments in the region around the Great Lakes. By entrusting me with the deepest knowledge, the elders I consulted have opened up an exciting field of interdisciplinary research in East African regional cultural history for the benefit of present and future generations, as the Omukama, the king of Kiamutwara in Bukoba area, said. Now, it is a great sort of topic, and I would have needed PowerPoint for you to see those people with your own eyes and visualize the maps and wonderful surroundings. But I will try to do my best as it is. So, when my topic is a regional study, but in order to be faithful, you have to have a local base. And my local base was Karagwe. And it's a marvelous country where it lies 150 kilometers. At that time, we had 150 kilometers to travel to get only petrol, you see? So it was quite an adventure to be there. And the Karagwe people, they are called the Banyambo. And the Banyambo, that is the name for the longhorn cattle. You don't see much here, but anyway, you may be able to discern the longhorn cattle. The Banyambo are the people, the Enyambo, they have got the names from the longhorn cattle, and they speak Runyambo. But now I will start to diffuse the first myth. Banyambo is not a tribe, because and tribe is not a viable term at all for our purposes to get into the roots and the origins of African culture. You have to operate with the concept of clans. And if you look into the whole setup of clans in Karagwe, there is only 20% of the clans there who are said to be indigenous. 80% of all the clans consist of people who have been traveling, who have been migrating for ages to settle there. So what is a tribe really? It is not a very good concept at all. So anyway, I got to know the people, and it took a very long time, but after some 2 years, they started to tell me their stories. And there is one old man called Samatai, you don't see him here, but anyway, that you would have seen in the PowerPoint. And he was the most fantastic storyteller, and he was not of Karagwe origin, actually. He was a migrant from Kigesi and Omhutubai clan. And he was an Enanga bowstring harp player at the court of Karagwe. He was given that very responsible work for the Karagwe kings, although he was not from there. But this man, he made me understand the value of cattle, and that was in the village of Akishaka in 1975, quite many years ago. Then I was fortunate, after some 20 years later, then I could pursue systematic fieldwork within an organization called Intelakustra, that is same as Great Lakes. Great Lakes Regional Research Center, which was formed in 1990. It was founded in Kampala by a group of researchers from Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. We had one from the then Zaire, but we missed him due to lack of communications. And our main goal was to treat the Great Lakes region as an ecologically coherent area and cultural unit. And as for my interest, interrelationships between the old Great Lakes kingdoms should be examined, stressing unity rather than fragmentation. Now, I would like to stress our overall aims. Was to contextualize the Afrocentric perspective without any bias of defense. We had to look into the culture and see what was really there. We couldn't defend, for instance, the king's participation in the slave trade. And our projected research result was, according to me and to us here, all of us today, an appreciation of African potentials and cultural values is crucial for raising self-consciousness of Great Lakes people and trigger development on all levels of society. So, a couple of years afterwards, it took a long time and a lot of struggle to get these ideas founded into Swedish university worlds. I moved from Lund University to Stockholm University and finally arrived in Uppsala, where I could present my thesis exactly 25 years after I was registered in Lund as a doctoral student. That is just 2008. So my study is called Origins of Kingship, Traditions and Symbolism in the Great Lakes region of Africa. So, now, why origins? That is the question. Why do we have to worry about the origins? Yes, we have to consider that in colonial history interpretations, the origins of kingship was attributed to the culture bringing so-called Hamites. I think you have heard about the Hamites. We will talk more later, soon. The history of kings, number 2, and culture became regarded as separate from the people. So, and how come that this myth originated? And accidentally, when we came to Bushangaro, Karagwe, we stayed only 4 kilometers from the old site of the Karagwe kings, the Rumanika. And now you don't see this picture, but I would have loved to show it to you a bit more clearly. It's a picture showing from Speke's diary, showing how he met Speke, one of the early travelers. He met with King Rumanika in Karagwe, 1862, and he had to first go to Karagwe in order to get access to the king of Buganda, because Karagwe was regarded as very powerful, and so the king in Karagwe at that time, Rumanika, he had the keys. He was a gatekeeper of the old king of Buganda. So then this Speke and Grant, his companion, they were very much impressed by the stature of this beautiful king, Rumanika, excuse me, who greeted them in the best British manner by shaking their hands. And so they stayed there, and they got all the good hospitality they enjoyed during their stay with Rumanika. They gave enthusiastic reports about it, and their conclusion was: these kings, he can't be one African. He must be one of us. So ideologically, they created the idea of the Ham. That they turned the Hamitic idea was a bit different, but they turned it and pretended thought that now they have got a counterpart in the civilization effort to spread, culture and civilization to these so-called Negroes. So then the myth started in Karagwe, which was very sad. Now, my contribution now, interpreted from inside the people's perspective, as follows. While earlier historical sources describe the cultures of the peoples of the interlacustrine region, my study goes a step further. I have developed analytic categories by using symbolism to interpret the socio-political developments which previously have been mystified and hence crystallized in theories as the well-known Hamitic theory. My analysis, combining a historical linguistic approach with the ecology of religion has facilitated a broader interpretation of kingship traditions and symbolism. In this way, cultural, historical developments in the Great Lakes peoples have been unfolding. So this is an interpretation from within. Now the question is, how do we find out a perspective that can involve the people's whole existential value system? What is the key issue here? I've called it the religious vision of the world, which means that African culture, from an insider's perspective, presupposes an understanding of the interplay between the visible and the invisible world, between the material and the immaterial reality. All the time there is an interplay there between those two worlds. So how do we now interpret African history? We have to find out what is the natural state of human beings. What is the ideal? The ideal is peace. Peace. And, you know, we were learned all these different greeting rituals. How are you? Agandi, Nogambaki, what do you say? How are the children? How is your husband? How is this and that? Oh, but I'm sorry, I was bitten by a snake. That comes after you can't communicate unless you really create that state of peace first. So now, what do people do when peace is threatened? Then the traditional experts must be consulted to explore the reason for infertility, sickness, or death. All these states are unnatural. Where men and women of divination skills, abafumo, find out why peace is threatened. And this is a friend of mine. You don't see her very well, but you would have seen very well if, on the PowerPoint. It's a wonderful old lady, Makambavasi. And I had many talks with her. It was in 1976. Then, now this lady is the first instance. Then number two, the case is transferred to the priest. The priest, the Mbandwa in this setting, sets herself in a state of spirit possession, and the spirits are invited to raise in her head. Singing and rattling her gourds, she enters a dialogue with the spirit, and then the spirit would advise her how to restore peace in the family. She communicates, but you don't see. But anyway, it was touching. Now we have to look into the function of the invisible world. The spirits of the dead are believed to participate in the existence of their living descendants. There are different categories of ancestor spirits: family spirits, clan spirits, or hero spirits. Ancestor spirits are not worshipped. They are not perceived as gods. You pray to them under the premise that they mediate your prayer to God, the Creator. It's about, the saints. As an ultimate measure, when all means had been in vain, the family father would turn directly to the Creator. So that is the function of the spiritual world. But the topography of the physical, visible world in the extended Great Lakes region would have been very helpful with a map, but it is the region between the extended Great Lakes region, between the Great Rifts valleys. And it is a high plateau, and it extends from Mozambique in the south up to the Red Sea in the north, or vice versa. And there people have been migrating from times immemorial. And there is a special passage here, dry corridor here, in which historical linguists have called, actually, they have called Karagwe Depression. And Karagwe Depression is it's a dry corridor intersected with mountains where people have been migrating up and down, and there are important historical sites there. And also on the western borderlands we have the great volcanoes of the Virunga volcanoes. We could see all of them in at certain instances from our place in Karagwe. It was where one could stand. It was as if you were standing on the roof of Africa. You could see 5 countries from where we were. So now there are interconnections between social structures and belief system. I talked about migration, and when groups migrating together settled down in a place, they became a clan and took on clan symbols inspired from the environment. If the original leader had distinguished himself in life, he became exalted to a clan patriarch and continued to be honored at the occasion of the new moon. The more powerful a man would be in the material life, the more powerful he would be expected to become in the spiritual world. Now, oral traditions would interpret migration and settlement projects in belief terminology. The Creator God has many names that mirror natural and social environment. In Kigezi, for instance, it borders Karagwe and Rwanda, they honor clan mothers, and the clan mothers are called Abakaikuro. And one name for God is Kahukaikuro, a dry skin that covers the sky, Iguru. That's very touching, I think. Every new settlement and state formation was perceived as a new creation. So, in that way, history would be interpreted as a continuous creation, because God continues to create. Now, interestingly enough, for your interest, there are many Banyarwanda here, and the crowned crane is the most important symbol of the first royal clans, and those can be referred in the overall terminology, the first creation, Emishamba, the pioneers, and you have to honor them. All the succeeding generations have to honor them specifically. Now, and they can be dated according to the timeline I have drawn up from inside, around 500 AD. And very specific for this first kings was the redistribution terminology principle, and this from Bagabo, Kugaba, to distribute, give. The king was ideologically the owner of the land, but he had to be given tribute, and all the gifts he was given, he was supposed to give further to those who earned it and those in need. So the kings were really a distributor in the first king, in the first. real, the origin is the distribution. So, and interestingly for you who have your umwami at heart, he really, I met him actually, it was in 93 in Nairobi. And he was the one who pointed out that his clan symbol was the crowned crane. And it was interesting because it is the crown, it's a kingly symbol. So we have, and it is still there on the Ugandan flag, and I hear that, I read in this book that the crown crane isn't it the symbol of Rwanda, the bird. Anyway, so I thought it was very exciting. Now we come to the white, I was interested in cattle, I was interested in the white cow. And here I was very honored to get access to this picture. I was at the occasion of the traditional installation 1993 at Budu, when the Kabaka Ronald Mwenda Mutebi was directed by the kingmaker Sebanobe to how to symbolically kill the white cow to feed the Baganda. His duty was to feed his people. This distribution principle came. And now, the interesting is that this tailless cow is per definition a bull calf, representing the first owners of the soil during the era before there were much livestock. And because now, if you look at the Rwandan or umami, which clan gave him the daughters in marriage? Do you know that? Huh? That is the Abega Kasi. They were the ones to connect the kings to the soil of the earth, because that was the most important thing. They had to be connected to the soil of the earth. And now, interestingly, the Baganda say, after this white cow, the tailless cow, Kinto brought the tail. So what does that mean? It's a riddle, of course, because all these things have to be told in riddles, in secrets. And now I'm not going to go further because it will take too long time, but I would have loved to expose a little bit more about this. But the thing is that Kinto can be defined as an ancestor, and he's for many more people than the Baganda. Even the Bohaya in the whole region, and in the final analysis, I have found that he must be of the monkey clan talked, because the monkeys clan were so important. But now, the thing is that when in colonial writing, the tragedy was that Kinto was paralleled with Ham. So, and that was in the logic of the colonialists. But now we can diffuse that, we can see from evidence from inside that Kinto was really not Ham. So I think we should learn from history to, as you say, keep together and stress unity rather than fragmentation. And I'm very happy to have been given the privilege to be invited here. And I would like you to unite with me in one proverb, and it says like this: Engaru ibili kunabisanya. That means we need two hands to be clean. You can't clean yourself with one hand. What is this? You don't go anywhere. So, Engaru ibili kunabisanya. which means here in this context, this fantastic organization, Watch Democracy Grow, we all need each other to build a better world. Thank you very much.